So, hi, I am the other Nicholas, or N-Dot. I go by Taylor, my middle name. I have been working for Microsoft for almost 5 years now, and I guess some more about my background was when I started 5 years ago, I started on the SignalR team. Who here has heard of SignalR? Wow, actually a lot of you. Surprised. So I started working on that team, and I was the first full-time developer on that team. That was fun. And then I decided, all right, been here for a year and a half. Let's do MVC, let's do Razor. And that's where I've been ever since. So it's actually been a really fun ride, obviously long enough for me to stay there. So today we're going to be talking about MVC Core 2.0. Who here has actually used ASP.NET Core? That's a lot more than I thought. That's awesome. Really cool. Really cool you guys are using that. I copied a lot of these slides from elsewhere, so I guess session objectives, we'll call this a session. So some of the two biggest pillars in ASP.NET Core 2 are something new called Razor pages, and the fact that we completely redesigned Razor under the hood. So everyone here is familiar with Razor, I assume, right? Yes? All right, cool. I'm going to be asking like a lot of these questions so I know how far to go into topics versus how far not to. So the more you participate, hopefully the better the talk will be. So Razor Pages is our new forms-centric way to write web pages. It's bundled in MVC, so you don't have to go and install a separate package. This is just part of MVC. And Razor had to be redesigned because as we were building Razor pages, we found a whole bunch of really problematic areas that kind of showed themselves in a way that we said we could make a general fix, or like we can make a hacky fix, or we could make a fix that affected all of Razor and made life easier for everyone using it. So Razor was redesigned. These are the two major concepts of ASP.NET Core MVC 2.0. So stuff in this talk that you'll be able to use, it will be in ASP.NET Core 2.0. I didn't put a release date there because nothing is like exact yet. Right now the thought is Q3 2017, so spring. So in spring you should be able to use this stuff. Again, we're all open source. You can just pull stuff down and use it as you please. That's also an option. So we have MVC, so what the heck is Razor Pages? Has anyone here heard of web pages? Like ASP.NET web pages? Yes, okay, a lot of you, cool. So there's a lot of similarities between Razor Pages and web pages, but it's not the same thing, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So we have MVC, and functionally MVC does everything we need. It allows you to decouple your front-end views from your code behind, have model binding, validation, all the various things you'd like to do in writing a website. Razor Pages is what we like to call the best of MVC with less ceremony. So model binding. At its core, the web is just a whole bunch of strings. So if you read data from a cookie, from a header, from a body, it's just a string. But one of the value adds to ASP.NET is that things are C#. C# is really nice to use. Well, model binding allows you to take these strings that the web is built up on and turn them into C#. So that's nice. We want to keep that. Validation. When you have a model, well, you probably want to validate that that model is something that you can use in your application. So is the current user over a certain age? Does their name fit a certain criteria? Validation. Filters. Being able to run a piece of code when a request comes in based on what you are rendering. That's important. Action results. You don't always want to return a view in MVC when you are hitting an API point. Maybe you want to redirect. One of the biggest common patterns these days is the post redirect get pattern. Has anyone here heard of that? All right. Has anyone here ran into the situation where you submit a form and then you hit refresh and you get that nice little dialog box? Yes, everyone? I assume most people have hit that problem. So this post redirect get pattern is a way to avoid that. So when you post to an endpoint, well, that post then returns a redirect, which redirects you to basically a get request. So when you refresh, you're not refreshing the post, you're refreshing the redirect, which is totally fine. You don't get that dialog. So that's one of these common patterns. Action results are nice. Tag helpers. Who here's used tag helpers? All right, a few. Last year I gave a talk on tag helpers, something really, really near and dear to my heart. They're pretty awesome. In Razor, it's not always best to write C# in C#. Sometimes if you're rendering HTML as like the end step, Well, you might want to write that as HTML. Tag helpers are a great way to do that. But the opposite's also true. In some scenarios, it makes more sense to write things in C#. HTML helpers are a great example of that. Tag helpers don't actually cover every single scenario you need. HTML helpers like .display4 are needed. And then, of course, Razor syntax. All these things are still available in Razor pages. And I know I'm just saying a lot of words right now. We're going to get to a demo. I'll show you code. But it's important to know that some of our goals when writing Razor pages. And of course, the rest of ASP.NET is still there. So you have logging, DI, cross-plat. If you want to constructor inject something into your Razor page, you can totally do that. If you want to log, you can do that. And of course, ASP.NET Core is cross-plat. All that just works. And finally, we wanted to give more flexibility when writing Razor pages. So in today's model of MVC, you have a controller. The controller has an action. That action then corresponds to a view. And that view may have a model. So that's a lot of ceremony, hence best of MVC, less ceremony. So we said, okay, well, how can we improve on this? Well, it'd be nice to have a Razor page be a single file script page. But that's not always what you want. Sometimes you actually do want that refactoring. You do want that separation of concerns. So as you'll see soon, you can also kind of go with an MVVM factored format to make it so you can separate things a lot better. Non-goals. There's definitely things we tried not to do. So back in 2011 when we released web pages, we were totally trying to compete with PHP. It was on every hosting environment's box, right? Wherever you went, there's PHP available. We said, well, why can't we? So when we released web pages, that was a really big goal for that. We're totally not trying to do that. By doing this, we ended up trying to build Razor into something that it wasn't. So MVC and web pages in the past, the only thing they shared the same between each other was the Razor language. The view engine was different. The HTML helpers were different. The layouts were different. How they were run, everything about them was totally different. Even though things may have seemed the same a lot of the times, you get different issues. This was a big problem. Say you wanted to learn how to do something in MVC, but it happened to be Razor related. Well, that's a problem if there's two different stacks that do the same thing, which kind of use the same language but differently. That's a problem. We're not trying to do that with Razor pages. Again, Razor pages is bundled at MVC, comes with the box. But it's definitely not a successor to web pages. There's a lot of inspiration from there, but it's not a successor because it's bundled. It's not something separate. Hiding C# with a DSL and Razor. So one of the things that we get like overwhelmingly from our customers is that people love people love C#. Like who here prefers C# over any other language? I personally do, right? We know that and we love that too. Like Razor shouldn't be trying to hide C#, and a domain-specific language to make that happen would be kind of defeating the purpose of Razor. It's a templating engine at its core to intermingle C# and HTML. So we don't want to create new things to hide the C# when it's already something that's really positive. We don't want to do new primitives. So what does that mean? When applicable, we don't want to write new directives. So a directive is like @inherits or @model or @inject. Those are what we call directives. We don't want to do that if we can prevent it, because everything that's done in Razor pages should be totally possible in MVC. Now, there were some exceptions. In Razor pages, we had to actually add a new directive to say, oh, this is a Razor page. But we're trying to limit those as much as humanly possible. We don't want one thing to work in only one domain. We want it to work everywhere. All right, so that was a lot of talking. So we're going to go through a demo. And does everyone follow that? Did that all make sense to some of the goals here? Yeah? Okay, cool. So I said there was a lot of ceremony, and this is a big problem when teaching a new developer how to, say, understand MVC, right? Because a new developer will typically start with, oh, I have index.html. That might render out some HTML. Great. Well, I now want to render out maybe the server time, or have a certain number of users, have some sort of server logic. So how do you do that? Okay, use MVC. So what do you need to do that? Well, I'll add a new project. Let's see what that looks like. Maybe I'll go with empty because I don't want all of the magic that these templates offer. I want to be able to understand what I'm doing. because I'm a brand new MVC dev. So it looks pretty simple. It's actually simpler than even what it looks like here in Visual Studio. Who here has actually played with VS 2017? Because that's what I'm using. Okay, a few people. It's actually pretty awesome. So if I go here and I look at what this looks like on disk, can everyone see that? Yes. Not being able to read it, I'll read it out loud. Don't worry too much about that. So this bin and obj folder, these are ephemeral. This is like artifacts of Visual Studio. Properties, there is a launch settings.json here. This tells Visual Studio how to run your application. So when you hit F5, what does it do? Again, not needed. You have an empty www root folder. And you essentially have these 3 files here, program, startup, and our project file. Now, no, that's csproj. Who here is used to seeing project.json? A lot of people? Okay, so not too many. So does this look familiar? Does this look foreign? So, okay, familiar. Foreign. Okay, no, that's awesome. So some background. We started off with ASP.NET Core tooling, having a project file as a project.json. So it was a JSON file. It was a declarative way how to say what your project looked like. If you followed ASP.NET Core at all, that's probably what you saw for the past about year and a half now. So we decided to change directions and said, well, if we're going to have this JSON format, we're going to lose a lot of the people who know and love csproj. Not to mention, what about their previous projects? What about what they built before? Well, it wouldn't really be compatible. That's a problem. So we went to csproj, and we have been making this transition. Sorry for those who've been using our tooling, because it's been a little lackluster. Hence ASP.NET Core 2.0, and we still haven't won out our tooling, but we're working on it. Anyway, so we have a csproj. So these 2 files can be combined if we wanted to. So really, what makes up a web project is just 3, quotes, 2 files. Okay, so we have our program.cs, because every web project is essentially at its core just a console application that runs a web server. So we happen to have a web host builder. We're using Kestrel. Kestrel is our new cross-plat server. Setting our content route, using some IIS features, and then this startup is where we configure magic. So here is our pipeline. We're adding console logging. If it's development and we happen to encounter an exception, well, we're going to show an exception page if we need to. Otherwise, we're just rendering hello world no matter where you go on the web server. Pretty darn simple, right? So we need to use MVC, so well, let's go ahead and let's add a reference to this. So one of the cool things of VS 2017 now is you can just right-click on the project and click Edit csproj. You can kind of do this in line. Pretty cool. So right now, the 2.0 packages are labeled as 1.20. Don't mind the version. That's just what our CI is creating right now. So pretend that said 2.0 and pretend you're happy with it. I know you can do it. It's OK. So we have ASP.NET Core and MVC as our dependencies now. So I added the dependencies. Next thing I need to do is, with ASP.NET Core, everything has services. So I'll add MVC. It didn't show up there yet because it's still restoring. We have to add MVC to our pipeline of requests. And I don't know if this actually restored. Let's click here real quickly just to see if it did. This guy, did I save? There we go. OK. So we're adding MVC services, and we're using MVC, but we actually have to use MVC with default routing. Now we can start using controllers and views in order to render some sort of server logic, right? Because the whole goal here is I'm a brand new dev, and I'm trying to learn how to write server logic. So great, I'll add a folder for controllers. I will add a controller to that folder, whatever a controller might be. So I happen to use the templates because this is what's easy. And as a person learning MVC, I have to know that, well, this is convention. I have to inherit from this magical class called controller. This isn't just some magic method. This is all convention-based. The name of this method corresponds to the view. If I hit run right now, I would get an explosion. It wouldn't work. It's a failure point. So great. All right, so what else do I have to do? Well, I have to add a view. So that view by default has to exist in a views folder. Great. If I could spell that, it'd be views. In that, I happen to have another folder in this that is corresponding to my controller. So home. And it's the first part of that, just because I have to know that convention. And then I can finally add my CSHTML file, right? So this is a headache. Has anyone here actually tried teaching MVC to someone who has never seen it before? It's not easy, and we get that. It's totally hard. Because finally, I'm saying hello from MVC, and then learning Razor on top of all this, right? That's difficult. So at this point, after tons of different failure points, I can finally run my application. Not very nice. And of course, this is just going to do hello from MVC. So Razor Pages is trying to fix what I just showed you, this whole cycle of problems. So let's do the same exact thing, but a little quicker this time, and with Razor Pages. So I'll do the same thing. I'll add an application. It's going to be empty. I'm going to, this time, instead of modifying the CS proj, I'm going to show you something kind of cool. Not because I need to, but just because I think it's cool. Who here has heard of or seen .NET.exe or .NET CLI? Yes? A few people? So with that whole backstory I gave you about project.json going to CS proj, a lot of the pushback from the community has been like, but we love JSON, it's so nice to use. So they've tried to make that CS proj look a lot nicer. So even just looking at this, that's pretty nice. All you have is package references here. It's pretty clean. But if even that's too much, you could also go ahead and do .NET add package Microsoft ASP.NET Core version 1.2.0 *. And this .NET command now has a command to update the CS proj for you. It's kind of cool. I think it's cool, at least. So let's do the same thing for MVC. So if I go over here and I look at my web application 1, I should have the same exact output or same exact project as I had before, and I do. That's pretty cool. So do people like that? Is that nice to have like a command to be able to modify the CS proj? Yeah. Okay. So that's cool. Anyways. So let's do the same thing we did before, is let's add our services, services.addMVC. And this time, instead of doing use MVC with default routes, I'll do .use MVC, just by itself, right? So at this point, I can now just add a CSHTML file. And this is what we're dictating as a Razor page. So hello from Razor Pages. The current server time is datetime.now. What makes this different is that new directive I hinted at page. So that directive up top is what dictates this as a Razor page. The rest is just CSHTML file. There's no controller. There's no crazy complex folder structure. There's a lot less ceremony. This is the ceremony I was referring to. The controllers folder, the views folder, the home that corresponds with the controller, right? That's a lot of ceremony. So at this point, I can actually hit Control F5 and I can run this. And I should get hello from Razor Pages. Pretty simple. So I mentioned that you may want to add more structure to your pages. And for people who are familiar with pages development or say PHP development, you'll typically do stuff like this. You'll do var message is equal to, and you'll capture this entire line of code. Maybe we'll use string interpolation here. And I will do datetime.now and spit out the message, right? AKA, you will write code, set something dynamic, and then render it. And this works just the same, no difference. I'll add a comma here just to kind of show that. Starting to get some form of more structure. Has anyone here ever used the app functions directive? Who here knows what the app functions directive is? Okay, a lot of people. So a refresher, functions. This corresponds to how Razor works under the hood. So at its core, Razor is a templating language. It intermingles HTML and C#, and it outputs a C# file, just one big class. That class has one method on it, one important method, render. So that method is called when you want to render that view. This functions lets you add stuff outside of the render method. So I can add something like a property, right? Everything outside of it, these guys, is all within the render method. So by adding this property, I can then just do message, message. Kind of getting more structure here. These are things you could already do in Razor, right? These are things. But what happens if I wanted to have a handler? So the whole point of Razor Pages is to have like a form-centric type of model that you could write your views in. So I can do iActionResult on get. So whenever a get request comes into my view, I want to execute some code. So I'll return the current view because I don't want to redirect, because action results can redirect. They could do various things. But more importantly, let's just say I want to move this message up here, right? Now here's kind of the face-palming moment. This is super early, and this actually doesn't work today. It will work. I promise you it will work. I need you to take my word on it that this will work and you will be able to do this. But when I say you can do single-page scripted environments, imagine you had it on get here and on post here. You had a form within your Razor page that could post to itself and then redirect or go somewhere else, right? Those are things that are possible. So I then said you could have an MVVM factored type of paradigm when writing Razor pages. So you can do this by simply adding another class. And we're going to call this it's a code behind here. So index.cshtml.cs. There is no naming convention here. I'm doing this because Visual Studio is awesome at like nesting things here. See how it nested that? It's kind of nice. So I just did that purely for that capability. So I'll call this index page model, and I'll inherit from a page model class. Next, I'll grab everything I did right here. So the idea is that once you find that your view is too complex, you can then move to this code behind model. So I now have a model. Great. How do I use this in my page? It doesn't just magically happen because there's no convention. So what you do is you do @model web application 1.index page model. And then this is now model.message. So I've now defined a handler for this page. So when an onGet method happens to, when a get method happens to be triggered for this page, this will then run, and it's going to return the view corresponding to it. So I can then run this, and let's make some sort of change here. I'll make that capital. And I get the capital F here. So this is all from the code behind. So when you find that your views start to get more complicated, well, you can then move to this model if you want to. And I'm just showing an onGet. You can do this with onPost. You can do this with onDelete, onPut, so forth. It's basically any HTTP verb. So Razor pages in a nutshell. All right, so what about, oh, go ahead, question.
It's not a controller. How is this not a controller?
So for the code behind, it's close to a controller. And so there's nothing wrong with MVC, first off. The MVC model, there's nothing wrong with it, and there's still a use case for that. All this is doing is it's enabling you to have a different way to contain your logic. So if you have a contact page, right? A lot of contact pages don't typically have a lot of complex logic or need anything from the controller. They just rendering static HTML. Because of that, should you have a controller for that? Should you not? Maybe not. If you had a code behind, it enables you to post to itself and treat itself as, it's the MVVM factored model. I think that's the best way to think about it. So like Angular, for example, right? They have a model that can be run on the page, and then you can factor that out into its own controller class. That is the model itself, MVVM. So it's a lot like a controller, and there's nothing saying that the MVC model is wrong. It's saying this is a grow-up story. So what about routing? Because this is just index.cshtml. This actually happened to be the convention-based way how to access this page. So let's just take a journey here. Let's pretend that this is running in production. Our site is currently running. I can refresh this page however I want to. If I go to another page, I get hello world, which is just because that app.run before. This is this right here. I'll change this to, oh, wrong thing. I'll change this to wasn't handled by MVC. Those things running. So what happens if I want to change how my page is accessed? So if this is running in production, there's actually one really convenient way I can do this. I can open up here, and let's just drag and drop a CSHTML file in. I'll copy and paste dropped.cshtml. So over here, without compiling any new code, it's going to compile once more just because I changed the C# file actually. I get hello from dropped in view. Pretty cool, right? There's no controller needed. I don't need to pull down any code. I don't need to recompile anything. I just dropped in a CSS_HTML file. So as you notice, the URL here is now /dropped because I'm no longer following that index.csh_HTML model. It's dropped. So I can take this one step further. And let's go to the dropped thing over here. And as you notice, this has a page. You can actually specify routes in here. So let's say I did hello. So it wasn't handled by MVC. It's no longer responding to the dropped endpoint because I changed how it's accessed. Instead, it's now dropped/hello. So by adding that route to the end of page, you're saying, well, on top of how you'd already access me, here's an addition. Is you can add all sorts of route constraints there, all the routing you're familiar with today. What happens if I wanted to change, say, the prefix here, like, I don't know, foo/dropped/hello? I could do that by simply adding a folder, because it matters of where this is on disk. So I could add a new folder here and just call this foo, and then drag my dropped file into there. Thank you. So this is no longer served, but that is not, right? So you can change how things are accessed. You can also, I mentioned you could add constraints. So if we jump back over to our index.csh_HTML here, what happens if I were to add, say, an int ID to this onGet method, right? Well, I can do /ID is equal to 123. And actually, I'm not rendering this out yet, so let me I'll throw the ID in here. Okay. And I should get hello 123 from Razor pages. Fun, right? So I can now add stuff in model bind. So I have model binding support. Well, let's add a constraint. Let's say that this is now required to be an ID, which is an integer. So this now won't hit anymore because it's not handled by MVC, because I said I require there to be an int there. So I could say hello. Also wasn't, because I said it's an int. But if I do 456, it works. So app page is kind of your entry into this whole new Razor pages format, which enable you to control how a page is accessed. And as you noticed here, I didn't change any of my C# code as far as routing is concerned, except for adding that int parameter that I wanted. I could have done all these things to change how things are accessed by simply dropping in a CSS_HTML file. That's pretty powerful.
Okay.
Yes?
Can you put multiple app page directives in the same file?
The question was, can you put multiple app page files in the same file? Today, I want to say no, and answer is I don't know if we've thought about that yet. This is still really early, so it's one of those things that I'd have to think about. Question? Yeah.
Can you put more constraints on the actual ID, like not just an integer, but let's say a range or something?
So any constraint that you could typically do within your over here, I'll show you this wrong thing here. Sorry. So this can take in a route builder. Route builder dot map route. Anything that you can do inside of here, you can do. So that is the limit of what you're capable of. Let's do this. So this is a rather simple example. Without writing out all the code myself, I have a kind of a more complex example here where we have, this is kind of like the layout of it. So this is a CRUD application. It adds customers, it edits them, it deletes them, and manages them. So I don't know if you can read this. This is a customers folder here. We have a new, an index, and an edit.csh_HTML file. And those guys are the bread and butter of this guy. So they kind of redirect to each other, and we'll take a look at that in a second. So by going to the customers, just like I said, we can create John, we can edit Doe, we can create another one. So you see I've already done this. We can delete. So pretty simple application, right? So this is all done by, I guess a good example here is edit. So this is a code behind edit.cshtml. It's being constructor injected because you can pull things from your dependency injection container in the constructor of your code behind. When a GET request comes in, well, we try and find the current customer that we're trying to edit. When we are trying to finalize our edit, this same code behind can then handle that post request. And so as long as the model is valid, we have all of our validation working, then we save our changes in our database, and then we redirect with this post redirect get pattern to the customer's index page here, which is over here. And this guy just does the same thing, takes in a DB on get, it retrieves all the customers, and then it can render them out. So this is Razor Pages in a nutshell. It's pretty simple, and the goal here is to make it so you can start out simple because you don't always need a new controller. You don't always need a model associated with a view. Sometimes you just want a view. You can drag and drop a brand new view to change what things are accessible on your page, or sorry, accessible in your website. Razor Pages is pretty powerful, but again, this is not to say that MVC is wrong, because there is a time and a place for when you would want to have that separation of concerns. This isn't the absolute correct model. It's what fits your purpose. So that is Razor Pages. And one thing that I want to point out is, see this app page here? VS has no idea what this is. And this is like one of these root issues here of why we had to redesign Razor, is that Visual Studio did not have enough tie-ins to how Razor worked to know about new things in Razor. And I'll explain that. Okay. So, like I just said, we had to redesign Razor. A lot of reasons here. So one of the things is to reduce coupling on Visual Studio. So as it stands today, whenever we ship a new version of Razor, Visual Studio doesn't actually understand what that is. So in this example, we're trying to ship Razor Pages, all these new constructs. Visual Studio has no idea. Hence, the app page was not recognized. I was getting those little red squigglies. Support custom Razor hosts. Who here has actually touched Razor's hosting system? Anyone? One person. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry. It's awful. It is absolutely awful. As it stands today, when we initially wrote Razor, it was to support both Web Pages Razor and to support MVC Razor. So because of that, the hosting to support that is really ugly. To change the way how things are parsed or rendered, you have to inherit and change absolutely everything about Razor. There is no just like, oh, I want to change a little aspect of it. You can't do that. It's everything or nothing. So that's a problem. So we wanted to allow simple extensibility of common language features. A good example of this is directives. So adding that ability to have app page, right? Having your own directives that have their own purpose. That would be nice. So C# has a really great editing experience. So bringing up the CSHTML editor to par with that. Example, you refactor something in a C# file. That refactor happens across your entire project. You see errors without having to open your C# file. Has anyone here actually ever refactored something in a C# file and then realized later that that did not happen in their Razor file? And the reason why is because it wasn't open, which is unfortunate. Razor files must be open for basically refactorings, errors to work and to happen. And I'll show you actually why that is. I'm going to go into a little deep dive-ish here in Razor in just a second, which is kind of cool. And then overall better tooling. So today with tag helpers, if you've used actually people, can I see the hands again for people who've used tag helpers? Oh wow, actually, okay. Yeah, it's a lot. If you want IntelliSense for them, if you're building them on your own, you have to rebuild your project and it has to be in a buildable state. It's not the greatest experience. You don't get your XML documentation for your tag helpers unless you kind of jump through a few hoops to do that. So kind of making these things nice as well. That's just one of the examples. So, diagram time. There's a lot here. We're going to kind of jump through this in baby steps. So when you open up a CSHTML file, Visual Studio has a Razor editor. That editor knows about that CSHTML file. This is all Visual Studio, this box. The editor then talks to Razor Engine. This is a DLL that Visual Studio shipped. And it says, can you give me the C# file for this Razor file? It says, okay, sure. And it does it. It returns it back. This is a DLL on disk when you install Visual Studio. This is a DLL on disk when you install Visual Studio. It then gets that C# file back and says, great, well, I'm going to create a virtual project here. So it's a fake project for all intents and purposes. This fake project is going to reference the one the CS_HTML file lives in order to make it so that CS_HTML file can use all the different features from your project. It then makes mappings from the whatever CS_HTML file is open to what the C# was behind. So when you see @datetime.now, it gives those highlights. It highlights all that stuff, which is what we call projections. So whenever it encounters an add tag helper, it goes, okay, great. I need to find tag helpers for whatever that assembly name is. So it says, oh, razortool.exe. Has anyone actually ever seen this before, razortool.exe? Okay, so this is something that is in your project. Denote outside of the box of Visual Studio. So when you add a package reference to Razor tooling, this is something that gets pulled in. So you installed this because it's your application. So Visual Studio asks your application, give me the tag helpers for the following assembly. This guy then says, well, I happen to have my own Razor engine because it's part of the project. It's not the same one that's on disk, it's the one that's part of the project. Now, all this does is give you tag helpers. So your tag helpers are great and they work just fine, but parsing, like @page. @page might exist over here, it doesn't exist over there, because we'd have to ship a brand new Visual Studio every single time we did it. So the idea is that there's two different Razor parsers. One that exists because you installed Visual Studio, and one that exists because you restored packages for your project. Right? That's a problem. So we redesigned it a little bit, and we said, great, we have a little bit of differences here. So when you open your CS_HTML file this time, it then asks this essentially an API surface. That API surface might say, give me the C# file for the following string of text. So Razor Editor says, great, I'll open up CS_HTML file, I'll grab that big string of text, I'll pass it over to this random method. This random method could do whatever it wants. Well, what it happens to do, it happens to just says, okay, great, I'm going to execute outside of where I am, outside of Visual Studio, kind of like how tag helpers were working in the old model, and let it do that. So it says, great, this is all stuff you installed in your application. So this Razor engine does know about @page. It does know about everything that's in your application. It runs, it parses your file, and it spits out a big class. It also does one extra thing. There's 3 C# files here, so actually I'm going to go back. Notice the single one. This means that whenever you have one CS_HTML file open, this exists. When it closes, this goes away. That's why when you refactor something, if you refactor something over here, it happens over here only if this file's open. In this new model, if you refactor something over here, well, all of these files are open because this host doesn't go away. It just stays up. It lives in the background. So great, I'll refactor that for you. I'll give you all the errors you want. You don't have to open every CS_HTML file. You can just get all the refactoring and get all the errors you need. The same experience as you have with your other C# files. And this Razor engine is the one that you installed. It's the one that you restored as your packages. Everything just works. So with this approach, we were able to then solve a lot of the problems of a lot of the coupling problems we had to Visual Studio. But this wasn't enough. Just because this Razor engine knew about @page, it might not know about Sebastian directive foo, right? Something that he maybe have created. So we had to add extensibility on top of that. So one of the extensibility points we added was custom directives. We tried to re-implement all of our directives on top of this system. We couldn't do every single one of them, but most of them we could. Inject is an example here where we did that. So if I click on this, it's actually incredibly simple how this thing is added. Okay. Can people read that? Yes? Okay, so this is all the magic you need to parse an inject directive. @inject, followed by a type name, followed by a member name. We take care of the rest. Great. We now know how to parse it. But just because we know how to parse it doesn't mean you actually know how to make it do anything. Sure, you might be able to give it the coloring. You might be able to give it all the niceties of you writing it out. But it's not actually going to do anything. So we have to add a brand new feature. We're using this Razor engine builder here. Everything is highlighted by this new Razor engine system. We add a new pass, and this pass harvests all of the inject directives. So we go through, and whenever we find a directive node in your document, we say, great, is this our inject directive? If so, capture it. Go through each one of those inject directives and add this to our C# file. So if I go over here, it's adding a property. Public type name, member name, get set, right? We've just now lit up the inject directive without any other work, and this is in total 89 lines of code to make the inject directive work. So imagine you being able to do this with your own system, having your own directives, doing whatever you want, making them light up in the ways that you want. And of course, this all just working in tooling. So getting all that nice IntelliSense so that you can really affect your own development environment. Customizing Razor as a whole. This is everything that MVC does to Razor today. So we register the inject directive, we register the model directive, page directive. We then add a few extra features, like view component tag helpers. I don't know do people know what that is, view component tag helpers? There's a new concept in new MVC called view components, and you can access them with tag helpers. But there's a whole bunch of things here. The main idea here is that we broke Razor apart into pieces that could be extended very simply. And then you can do that, and you can get that experience when you're editing as well. So that's pretty cool, and that's actually about all I had. So I'd love to take questions. Question?
The custom directives, you can use them in both Razor Pages and MVC?
Correct, yeah. So Razor Pages is no different than the Razor Page syntax is no different than the MVC syntax. The only real difference there is the @page directive, which is just to denote that something is a Razor page versus something that's not. Yep. Okay, any more questions? Question?
So when you look at Razor Pages, the one thing that is, how hard is it to unit test? Because it kind of makes me feel like web forms was really hard to unit test. And would this suffer from some of the same?
It absolutely would. It absolutely would. And the answer is that, the right answer is, you can't unit test as easily as you can with controllers, with views, and having that separation. You absolutely can. But sometimes you don't want to, right? Do you really want to unit test that your static contact page renders what it does every single time? Maybe not. So it's a choice left up to you as to what pattern fits better. Question?
Just to clarify, is Razor Pages part of Razor, or is it part of MVC Core?
So Razor Pages is a part of MVC Core.
Okay.
So we expanded Razor's functionality to make it so MVC could configure it to do whatever it wanted to do. And Razor Pages was one of the driving factors to say, okay, well, we need to support the following feature because Razor Pages wants that. And that was kind of the driving factors behind it. Any more questions? Well, cool. Thank you, guys.